I went to one interview with someone who had been the head of an Islamic militia in the Purwakarta region during the revolution. And about half an hour into the interview, I realised that it wasn't him. It was someone with the same name who had been active not in Purwakarta but in Garut. So at the moment when I realised this was the wrong person, I felt a bit discouraged, but we had an interesting talk, we had an interesting interview after all, and you never know what's going to come out.
Hi, Prof Robert Cribb, how are you?
Good morning, very well, thank you.
We are surrounded by nature and there's a tower there. Before we go into unpacking some of your work, I would like to start with your thinking about learning, right? Your area of study and work is very diverse and varied, and ranging from crime and justice, empire, colonization, revolution, and conservation. So, what drives you to learn? What drives you to pick a book and decide, I will teach myself and learn something?
Well, I've always been curious about the world. If I go into a bookshop, I always go first to the history section and then to the popular science section. And the difficulty is always choosing which books to buy, which books to take away. So the world is full of such interesting things. I'm a bit like a child in a lolly shop when I go into a bookshop and when I contemplate what I could be investigating next.
And as someone who is also interested with so many different things, Evelyn called me a magpie because I like to teach myself, grab on something new to learn. But do you think you are a focused person or you like to do many things at once?
I very much enjoy when I can focus on a single thing.
Yes.
But the problem with focusing on a single thing is that it may make your life dependent on that single thing.
Yeah.
So for as long as I've been employed, at least, I've had to do many, many things. So I've had to set time aside to focus on one thing after another. So the answer is I do a bit of both. But really, I like having many things on the go at any one time. I'm probably a little bit more of an opportunist. I respond to opportunities. I respond to what other people are interested in. I don't necessarily have an agenda that I want to push to change the world, but I do want to make the world a better place. So as long as I can remember, I've wanted to do something that involved history and something that involved other languages. So it's a privilege to be able to work in a field where I use more than one language source. I still get a kick out of using non-English sources in my research. So the excitement comes from making discoveries in many different places and bringing them together, and then communicating the insights, communicating the knowledge to the rest of the world. I come from a family of academics. My parents are both botanists. Two of my grandparents were botanists. So I come from a scholarly family. When I was a child, we spent a year in Europe when my father was on study leave. and that gave me a deep interest in both history and languages. So I knew that I wanted to work on history that involved using sources other than English language sources. The reason why I chose Indonesia is somewhat coincidental. I studied some Indonesian history at high school, and shortly after that visited Indonesia. I thought this is a fascinating place, which is also important for Australia. It was an organised tour. It was billed as a study tour, so there was a certain amount of history involved. And I thought this looks like a fascinating place. It's important to Australia, so I should keep going. So I studied Indonesian history at University of Queensland and continued to be fascinated.
Through your PhD and through your life work, there's a lot of snowballing where you are driven by intuitions and grab those opportunities. Like you said, it came through really, really vividly during your PhD at SOAS,
Yes.
right? Because in fact, you're spending most of your time not at SOAS, but all over the place,
That's
right?
right,
So I want to
yes.
unpack that a little bit. I want to unpack your PhD experience under the supervision of very influential and known to be very meticulous scholar, Prof Ruth McVey. What made you decide to do PhD at SOAS?
After I'd finished my undergraduate degree in Australia, I wanted to have experience of another university system. So I had considered doing the PhD at ANU or at Monash, but to me it would be much more interesting to do it somewhere else. Ruth was one of the leading figures in Indonesian history and politics, so the fact that she was there was also a great attraction.
Your PhD investigate occupied Jakarta during Dutch colonial period, and particularly tracing these social basis of Indonesian revolutions, right?
Yes.
Which lead to your work, gangsters and revolutionaries.
Yes.
What made you decide that, I want to study this?
Well, as an undergraduate, I had been fascinated by the Indonesian Revolution, fascinated by the way in which Indonesian nationalists had managed the challenges of coming out of the Second World War, coming out of Japanese occupation, facing Dutch attempts to come back to Indonesia, the clever way in which they manoeuvred in a difficult international situation, the way in which they organised their armed resistance to the Dutch. So that was what brought me to the Indonesian Revolution. So I came to SOAS wanting to work on that topic. Ruth's advice was to focus on something specific and to see what grew out of that. So to embed myself in sources and find things that no one knew, to find things that would be exciting. So we discussed various possibilities and settled on Jakarta, which was in many ways at the very heart of the revolution, especially in the early months. So I used the British archives and then the Dutch archives and then newspaper sources at Cornell, and then went to Indonesia to talk to people who'd been involved in the revolution in Jakarta. I was interested in the nationalists. I was interested in the Republicans who were in Jakarta trying to deal with the fact of growing Dutch power in the city. But as I worked through the Dutch archives, I became increasingly aware of this Jakarta underworld, the gangsters who had formed their private armies, their people's militias, and who played a major role in preventing the Dutch from seizing power in Jakarta early in the revolution. Increasingly, I became convinced that they were an important element in the success of the Republic. So my interest was, how did the Republic succeed? And I discovered that it wasn't just the army, it wasn't just the diplomats, it was also this people's militia that provided a crucial opportunity for the Republic to consolidate in the early months after the Japanese surrender.
And were you required to learn Dutch as part of your PhD, or was it like your decisions to do it?
It was my decision. I'm sure Ruth would have insisted that I do it, but she didn't need to put any pressure on me.
Interesting. And it really came true, right? That decisions like, oh, I need to do this. I want to learn this language. I need to learn this language through your work. But the other thing that is so interesting for me is your methods, your snowballing methods, right? Because you are at so many different places. Like you said, you spend time in the Netherlands, you spend time in Ithaca, Cornell, you spend time in Jakarta. And in a way, you were affiliated with few scholars and few institutions, but you were more of a free agent in the course of your data collections, right? When you were in the Netherlands, you were attached to Leiden, but you were not necessarily, attached to the institutions per se, right? How do you approach your archive and data collections there?
So I suppose there were two aspects in the Netherlands. One was sitting in the archives, and I simply used the inventories in the archives to work out what documents to read. Ruth had given me a number of contacts in the Netherlands, and so I talked to those people. That took me to Leiden University, and there were also a number of Dutch researchers in the archives. We would go out and have morning tea and sometimes lunch together, and so that got me involved in the Dutch academic environment.
How did you make your introductions to these different scholars?
I introduced myself. So when we were sitting in the foyer having Dutch coffee for morning tea, of course it's natural to ask other people, what are you working on?
Yeah.
And so we would exchange information on what we were doing.
And at Cornell, you work and interact quite a bit with Audrey Cahin, Prof. Audrey
Yes.
Cahin, a very influential scholar, interpreter of the Indonesian history. How did you approach your visit at Cornell? Was it more of a, oh, I want to interact and sharpen my idea, or what was the approach primarily?
So at Cornell, my main interest was the library collection. There was a wonderful collection of Indonesian newspapers from the time of the revolution. It was collected by John Eccles at a time when no one else was collecting material from Indonesia. So it was a truly wonderful set of materials that I could use to back up the archival research on the one hand, and the later interview work that I did on the other. But Cornell was an exciting place to be. There was a really vibrant Indonesian studies group there. Ben Anderson was very kind and allowed me to sit in on his Indonesia seminar. There were brown bag lunches every week that I attended. And so in terms of being part of an Indonesian studies community, Cornell in those days was one of the most exciting experiences that I'd had.
How did you approach your archive, and because you are reading these different archives, right? Were you aware these are trove of archive that I want to work on? Or were you more of a, oh, I need to go there and then I'll investigate things that I can work on and how to triangulate and make sure that my reading is correct? Like, what was your approach in archive and treating your materials there?
Okay. Through Ruth McVey, I knew that the Dutch colonial archives from the revolutionary period had recently been opened. So for a long time they had been closed for all research, but I was very fortunate that I was one of the first researchers who was given open access to this material. Those collections were a bit of a mess. They'd been put together at the time of the revolution, when the Dutch had other things on their mind than keeping well-organised archives. They'd been bundled together and taken to the Netherlands and dumped in the archives. They'd been inventorised, but they weren't in ordered collection. So I spent a lot of time just going through things, trying to find what I could find from this collection. I gradually found that there were a lot of interesting intelligence materials that related to the gangsters and to the people's militias in Jakarta. Of course, they were from a Dutch point of view, but it's not actually very difficult when things are constructed very much from a colonialist point of view, to look beyond that, to try and work out what might be on the other side, to work out what the people involved might have wanted, might have been doing. But it meant that I had a list of names, a list of people that I could hope to interview when I got to Jakarta. So I had that list of names in my mind, and I began to ask who was there, who was still alive. Some people had died, some people died while I was there, but before I got a chance to interview them. There were other people who hadn't appeared in the archives, but who turned out to be interesting and important. So I followed my nose. I followed the possibilities as they arose.
Was there particular eureka moment, like you said, that when you were reading archive in The Hague, it became increasingly apparent for you, oh, this is something that I have to focus on. I have to focus on these interactions between the People's Army and gangster, right? So what was the particular eureka moment? Was there any particular eureka moment, like, aha, this is what I was supposed to focus on, or was it more of a gradual process?
It was very much a gradual process. I think for most historians, eureka moments are rare or non-existent. The essence of historical research is ploughing through a vast amount of material, primary sources from all sorts of places, putting them together and gradually seeing the potential. So there wasn't any single moment at which I thought, aha, this is where I need to change my direction. It was a very gradual process. It was a matter of seeing additional opportunities and gradually deciding that those additional opportunities were perhaps even more exciting than the topic that I'd started with first.
Yes. Your fieldwork in Jakarta led to your book, Gangsters and Revolutionaries, right? Like you said, through reading archives, you were introduced with this a host of fascinating characters, like General Mustopo and Haji Darib to the gangster unit, yes, which saw service to the Dutch as Her Majesty Irregular Troops. And to make this character alive, other than archive, you managed to interview a few of them,
yes,
actually. And this is quite fascinating, right? Because it's not very easy to, especially as a white man coming to Indonesia, and to introduce yourself and embed yourself in this in the field with this Preman that is a little bit more, they talk differently, they behave differently, right? How did you manage to convince them for an interview?
For most of the revolutionaries who had been active during that revolution, this was the greatest moment of their life. They had been involved in something that was for the whole Indonesian people. They'd been part of the liberation movement. For many of them, what happened after that was disappointing. And so the fact that someone was coming from outside, from Australia, to talk to them about their experience was exciting for them. Of course, not everyone was excited, and the ones who weren't excited perhaps didn't want to talk to me. So there were some people that I didn't get to talk to. But the fact that I was Australian and not Dutch, the fact that I spoke reasonable Indonesian helped, and the fact that, of course, I was really sympathetic to the Indonesian national struggle was a big part of it. Every interview is very much a personal interaction. So there were some people that I got on immediately very well with. There were other people where the interview was difficult and a bit strained. There were some interviews where I really ended up not particularly liking the person that I talked to. I remember there was one who told me that he wanted me to organise for him to give a speaking tour in Australia. And I wasn't really able to do anything like that or promise anything like that. But there were many who were very pleased to tell me about what they had experienced, what they had done, and I went back and talked to them many times about their experiences.
And how did you establish confidence, like trust?
Well, I suppose the first thing is I was honest about what I was doing. I didn't attempt to deceive them about my research. And of course, fortunately, my research was something that interested them as well. And I also did the usual Indonesian thing of talking about all sorts of things before we got down to business. So we chatted about life and the world and Australia and whether I was married and all the things that we talk about in Indonesia as a preliminary to getting down to business.
And were you there for an extended period? Is that essential, you think?
So I was there for a year, and that made a big difference. It meant that I could fit in with their program. If they were busy, I didn't have to press them to talk during puasa or anything of that kind. And I could go back many times. So there were a number of interviews where the first interview was not particularly useful, but the second interview was really very, very effective.
Interesting. And one of the things that I'm curious about was of obviously their private language, right? Because Jakarta, especially certain segment in Jakarta, talk differently.
Yes.
And how did you understand? Or were there a particular moment where you confused about how they converse, basically?
Oh, absolutely. There were some interviews that were not as useful as they could have been because I was really struggling to hear to understand what people were saying. There were other interviews that were done in the front room of people's houses with traffic going past, and that was also very difficult sometimes. Of course, not being part of the community means there's many things that you don't understand, many cues that you don't pick up, and it's inevitable. It's a real shame. On the other hand, as an outsider, you have the privilege that people don't immediately embed you in the local politics, in the local relations. As an Australian, I was recognised as someone from a basically friendly country. I came as a friendly observer, and people explained things to me. I could ask simple questions, and people would take the time and the trouble to give me a simple answer. I could ask follow-up questions. So there's big advantages in being an insider. There's also advantages in being an outsider. Okay, so I always tried to take my interview partners seriously. I wanted to treat them as, of course, as human beings, as historical agents, to find out what they remembered about their role and their experience and their observations in the past. So it was very rare that I challenged them. Sometimes if they said something that I thought didn't agree with what I had learnt in the archives, I would ask them a follow-up question as a matter of curiosity. I would say, I thought it was like this, but you're saying it was like this. And they would then explain why they thought it was as they had told me. So I wasn't in the business of confronting anyone about their past. In the Netherlands, I talked to quite a few former Dutch colonial officials to try and get an idea of just what they had imagined they were doing at the time, what their concerns were, what their preoccupations were. I took the same approach to Indonesia. So I was never interested in confrontation, always interested in drawing out from people what they had experienced. One of the most difficult things was when I talked to someone who had already written their memoirs. And the problem with memoirs is that the memoirs fossilize, they preserve a particular set of memories. And I often had the feeling that I'd asked a question and it was like pressing a button and getting chapter 1, pressing another button and getting chapter 2. So in those circumstances, I would try and think of different questions that might unlock answers that were not simply answers that arose out of the memoirs that people had written. When I decided that interviews were important, I realized that I needed to do as many as possible. So I didn't have a limited list. I didn't have a target. My aim was to interview as many people as possible because you never know what each interview is going to produce. When I interviewed someone, if the name of someone else came up and I didn't know whether that person was still alive, I would ask so-and-so masih ada? And if they were still alive, I'd ask, do you know how to get in contact with them? And very often at the end of an interview, I would ask, is there anyone else that you think I should talk to about these things? So sometimes they would suggest a name that hadn't come up in the interview, but someone that I knew from the archives. Sometimes it was an unknown name. And if it were possible, I would then go and interview those people. So I found two really important things in interviews. One was, of course, always to take the people seriously, to ask them questions about their role, about their interests, about what they had experienced. But the other thing was to bring my own knowledge. So I could ask them questions based on some serious knowledge about what had taken place during the revolution. And I had the experience a number of times when I would get, I suppose this was particularly from former military personnel, I would get the standard military view of what had taken place. And then I would ask a question that was very specific based on my knowledge of what had happened. And they would say, oh, you know about that. Okay, so now I can tell you. So you're a serious researcher, and I can give you some more serious insight. Of course, everyone has their own agenda when they're being interviewed. I don't imagine that I'm getting a full, true story from everyone. But nonetheless, everyone is also interested in talking about themselves. They're interested in talking about their life, their experience. And so I tried as far as possible to make the interview an enjoyable experience for the person being interviewed.
Definitely. And when I was in Malaysia, at first it was very difficult for me to get interviews with people. But after having published a few articles and show them that, see, I have a bit of knowledge about Malaysia, then they're more open. And I think there is something to that, to show to your interviewees that you are serious, right? You take them seriously.
Exactly. Yes.
And did your interactions in Jakarta with these various people change the way you read archive?
I was conscious then that interviews would be an important part of the eventual conclusion. So there was no moment at which I said, I've got to read the archives in a different way. But I was always conscious that I needed more than the archives in order to build up a good picture of what was going on in Jakarta during the revolutionary years.
Right. I was fascinated by how you open your story, and you always open it with these various descriptions of geography, of the ancient history before setting up context, before we came into that moment, right? And where is this writing style came from?
It's an interesting question, and I don't have a good answer to it, but I suppose I've always tried to write something that I myself would find interesting. And these days, when I'm giving advice to my PhD students, I tend to say, don't start too early. Don't circle around the topic. Plunge straight into the topic as soon as you can. And this is partly because I realize that my own temptation is to start a long way from the topic and to sail around the topic before I get into it.
Yeah, and the book itself tells these fascinating stories of tacit alliance and also the decay, right,
yes,
of that tacit alliance between gangster, the preman in
yes,
Jakarta, and revolutionaries. And you noted that preman or gangster is an ancient feature of the social landscape in Java. And the lawlessness in 45 was not just because of this gangster, but because the revolutionaries trying to overthrow the Dutch colonial
yes.
at the moment. When you read this account, right, when you started to make sense of this account, as they came together, how did they create some sort of order and hierarchy?
So the relationship was very much based on opportunism. So the leaders in Jakarta had an interest in telling the outside world that the Dutch could not restore order in Indonesia. They had an interest in saying that it's only with independence that Indonesia can get back on track as a prosperous country that will be part of the global community. So they had an interest in the chaos that was being created by the gangsters. Of course, the gangsters themselves had an interest in independence. They wanted to be part of this national struggle. So the institutional connections between the two were dependent on the shared interests rather than having institutional strength. And those institutional links evaporated as soon as the shared interests also evaporated.
Yes, and how integral you think this violence as an attempt to create order? I felt like in many nation building in general, violence is often the first start to create order.
When I was writing the PhD, I wasn't specifically interested in the question of violence. I was much more interested in the question of legality and illegality. I was interested in the way in which people used legal structures and chose to sit outside legal structures in order to pursue their political aims. It was only gradually that I came to realize that violence was a much more important part of social structures than I had understood at the time. And so I've become fascinated in the way in which violence is used to maintain social orders and in the way in which violence can sometimes overturn social and political orders. I don't see violence as the only determinant of the political order, but I think it's really important to understand that it's there underlying the political structures that we deal with historically and today.
What did Ruth McVey, Prof Ruth McVey said when she read your account?
So other PhD students would sometimes say to me when they heard that I was being supervised by Ruth, Ruth McVey, what's she like? So I understood always in being supervised by her that I needed to present my very best work to her. And so that's what I aimed to do. So I very much felt that the approach at SOAS and Ruth's approach was that I was at the cutting edge of research. I was doing archival research, I was doing interviews. I was the one in the strongest position to make statements about my topic. Her task was to make sure that I made those statements as clearly as possible, as clearly and as sharply as possible.
Your next project is this huge milestones of dictionaries and atlas. You are collecting quite a lot of troves of information, and you start, the timeline is quite long. You start 1.9 million years ago with hominids making themselves known to modern researchers through archaeological evidence. What made you decide that this is going to be my next project?
I had begun teaching by the time I started the historical dictionary and the atlas projects. And I was in Australia, I was part of the Australian Indonesianist community. And I was struck at the time by the fact that people who worked on contemporary Indonesia often knew relatively little about earlier periods in Indonesian history. And I thought that was a great shame. So my ambition in putting together the historical dictionary was to make it easy and attractive for people for other scholars to reach back into Indonesian history, to inform their research on current Indonesia, on contemporary Indonesia, with historical knowledge. I'd always been fascinated as a student by Fowler's Modern English Usage, which is a kind of dictionary of words and phrases and grammar and expressions in English, which has a wonderful system of cross-references. So you're led from one reference to another to things that you hadn't ever expected to investigate. And that was my ambition with the historical dictionary. I wanted people to look one thing up and to use the cross-references to look up something else and something else again.
And I think the most profound impact of your book is that juxtapositions of various different things, geography, maps and history that create these impressions that Indonesian history is this interconnected web of many different things coming together and shaping the course of history. And is that also how you conceptualize map as something that is not just about geography?
Because the dictionary is trying to create a web of interaction in terms of time, and the atlas is trying to create a web of interaction in terms of space. It's trying to show how far away things were, how things were concentrated, what you can discover by looking at a map that is much more difficult to express in terms of words. And the atlas arose out of the fact that I was looking for maps to illustrate the dictionary, and found that it was very difficult to find useful maps. And so I decided that should be the next project. I took some advice from the technical departments at University of Queensland, where I was at the time. But basically, I taught myself using a program called Corel Draw. Very much later, I moved to Adobe Illustrator, but it was very much a process of teaching myself how to use the software, how to get data onto the maps, and also trying to learn how to design the maps. There was always three elements in any map. There was the question of the information, which I could show. There was the technical issue of how to put that information in visual form, and then there was the design element, how to make it a beautiful looking map. So some of my maps are beautiful, some of them are not so beautiful. They've got information, but they don't look so beautiful. But it's a constant learning process. I'm still drawing maps and still learning how to make them look and work better.
Yes. And the thing about maps and dictionary, especially dictionaries, right, is it's quite huge responsibility to write, because when you are describing things, you often make causal claims. There's a lot of causal claims about how certain things is being described, and one interpretations could change, right? Because there are often quite a lot of interpretations with regard to certain terms and certain. Yes. And how did you approach this causality about the past? Like, what's your process of thinking?
So there's two elements to the question. One is the direct question of causality.
Yeah.
That wasn't so much of a problem because I was looking at structural connections. I was looking at the way in which one institution was transformed into another institution. And that was a matter of digging up connections, but it wasn't a politically sensitive issue. The question of terminology is much more sensitive. So it's a question, for instance, what to call the western half of the island of New Guinea. At one stage there was a question of how we should spell Aceh. So my view is that it's really important to have scholarly discussion without getting hung up on terminology. So for the most part, I tried as far as possible to choose neutral terms. It's not that I don't think that political discussion is important. It's crucially important, but I don't want to start the discussion by signalling where we stand in terms by using terminology. So I always avoided using, for instance, freedom fighters or terrorists.
Yeah.
I wanted to use terminology that was neutral as far as possible, that could then lay the basis for making moral and political judgments.
In your entry, you tied this history of collaboration and resistance, and it also, to some extent, connect to the way you wrote Gangster and Revolutionaries, right? And how should we make sense this historical nuance of collaboration and resistance?
Okay, so I'm always interested in the way in which people respond to difficult circumstances. I don't see history as black and white. There's always a dark side to the good side. There's always a redeeming side to the bad side. And I'm interested in the way in which people reconcile the good and the bad, the way in which they deal with wicked problems, in a sense, in the way they deal with challenges in which there is no unambiguously good solution, in which there's no unambiguously bad solution either. So the issue of collaboration is one of these circumstances where the moral and practical issues are really foremost. What do you do when you're facing power that you cannot overturn? Do you work with it? Do you make the most of the circumstances? Do you salvage something from the wreck? Do you take a principled stand, bearing in mind the risk is that you may lose everything?
And what's also interesting about this history, this nuanced approach to history, is it often goes against the master script, right? Like as an Indonesian, I was taught that 300 years of Dutch colonialism, for example, right? There's no collaborations existed in that period, and to some extent it informed your subsequent work, that in crime and justice especially, that goes encroaching into this space of myth busting almost, like a genocide that never was, for example, political genocide in post-colonial Asia. And how should we understand this creation of myth almost as a path to power?
So myth is often a very important element in moral claims. So people base their moral claim to rights in the present on the basis of what happened in the past. And it seems to me that it's really important to make sure that those claims are based on historical reality. Many terrible things happened in the past, and they generate justifiable and important moral claims in the present. And I think it's really important that we don't give space in that moral framework to people whose moral claims are based on falsehood. So for me, one of the really important things that historians do is act as spoilers. We show what really did happen in the past, as far as it is possible to do so on the basis of evidence. Of course, we're never going to get there exactly right, but we need to be source critical, we need to be as accurate as possible, and to call people out when they are making claims about the past that are not defensible in terms of evidence. And then on that basis, we can deal seriously with the moral claims that do arise from the past. Well, I remember in the late 1980s, I was helping to organise an Asian Studies conference here at ANU, and I was trying to think about the issues in Indonesian history that still needed to be addressed. And it seemed to me, without very much thinking then, that the massacres of 1965 were a really important issue that everyone glossed over. They were present in a lot of historical narrative, but they were not analysed, they were not taken seriously. That period, the massacres of 1965, became, of course, an enduring interest in my research. Really important, it seems to me, in Indonesian history to recognise that there was this massive, destructive, brutal event in Indonesian history. These days, it's no longer necessary to push that point. Most people do recognise that the massacres were a pivotal moment in Indonesian history, but still working out just what took place, why it took place, and what its implications were for the Indonesia project as a whole, and what its implications were for Indonesian politics and Indonesian society. It still seems to me that's one of the big agendas for Indonesian studies.
And to some extent, what you really show is that path to power, right? These various paths to power, from violence, creating myths, and obviously the other thing is subjugations, and which shines through your work of minorities, and minorities in Indonesian history, for example, and also to some extent conservations, right? Your work on conservations, where they tend to subjugate, that there is that interactions. What is it about subjugating and subjugations that is, serve as an important part of path to power?
So I'm interested in that question of subjugation because it remains unclear how much it's determined in a utilitarian way, how much it's simply a consequence of the need that people feel to come to power, and how much it might be understood psychologically, how much it's a part of the perks of power, how much it's a part of a kind of human desire to be dominant, which is not actually necessary. So one of the big questions in terms of the 1965 massacres in Indonesia is how necessary was this mass killing for the new order to come to power? If it wasn't necessary to kill 500,000 people, then why did it happen? What was it in the minds of the people who carried out these massacres? Was it panic? Was it desire for domination over other humans? And I'm interested, of course, in how that question of desire to dominate also translates into human relations with the natural world.
And as someone who believes in personhood, animal personhood, when I read your account, and you also wrote, for example, orangutan culture, right? Which in a way, put that animal as some sort of one that needs to be looked at, right? Like this sentient being.
Yes.
And but in the difficulty about conservation is obviously this dehumanizations, right? This treating animal or treating others as less of a priority, which become the other layer of path to power, right? Dehumanizations, even in the mass killing. When they try to when they the way they justify killing the Chinese is to dehumanize the Chinese as these people without religion, these people who deserve to be killed, right? And what is it about dehumanizations that so ingrained in path of power, especially during this crisis and violence?
So that question gets to the heart of the deep philosophical issue that I'm interested in. And I think that a lot of what happens is not about dehumanization. It involves recognizing that the people who are being killed or oppressed are indeed human. And a lot of what is done to them is precisely because they are human, and they're regarded as in some way as having transgressed what is required to be treated properly as fellow human beings. So the way in which we treat the natural environment is often completely utilitarian. It doesn't involve any moral judgment about the status of a kangaroo or a gum tree. It's simply we can make money or we can make space. They're useful to us. The way in which we treat other human beings is often not just utilitarian. It involves some very complicated moral calculation about their worth as human beings. So one of the really interesting things about looking at orangutans is that they sit on that margin between the natural world and the human world. So they were a way of exploring how human beings thought about humankind when it was almost human or perhaps not quite human. There's a lot of humanist thinking which is in fact very productive in terms of moral treatment of other humans. But when we get to the edge, when we get to the creatures that sit right on the edge between humankind and non-humankind, we start to ask those really difficult questions about what are the obligations that arise for us in treating other human beings. I think dehumanization is a false path to explore because we're actually treating these people as humans in a very brutal way.
Your recent project, Cambridge History of Southeast Asia project, and obviously one of my favorite chapters would be the chapter on order, right? As you bring your different expertise and basically brought reader from early Southeast Asia, order in Southeast Asia, all the way to the current to the current period. And what's really interesting from your order chapter is that kind of understanding of order that is very fluid, right? Because there's that one map that you have that really show this pattern of subordination and subordinations compared to the usual way international relations scholars think about order that is a bit more hierarchical in nature, right? So would you be able to just give a little bit of background about how you get involved into this project? And how did you finally wrote that chapter on order before we unpack the chapter itself?
Okay, so the first edition of the Cambridge History of Southeast Asia was published around 30 years ago. It had a relatively conventional structure, relatively large and relatively chronological chapters. Now, a few years ago, Barbara Andaya, who's at the University of Hawaii and who is the general editor for the new Cambridge History of Southeast Asia, approached me and asked me if I would edit the volume 3, which covers the period since 1800. And after hesitating a little, I agreed that I would do it. And I tried to think about what would be the most useful and most effective way of dealing with the structure. Because Southeast Asian history, of course, falls easily into national histories, there was a risk that the Cambridge history would also fall apart into national histories. So I decided to take a very structured approach, which was to have every chapter, and we've got about 29 chapters, every chapter going from 1800 to the present and covering the whole of Southeast Asia in a specific thematic way. Yeah. So we have language and literature, we have transport, we have architecture, we have international relations, the international order. And I decided that I would do the international order chapter. So my aim, both in this chapter and in taking that approach to the Cambridge history as a whole, was a little bit like the thinking behind the historical atlas and the historical dictionary, that we need to embed history in the present. We need to show that the present is the product of long-term historical processes. We need to show that history has, that what took place in the past was not one undifferentiated mass going back from just before you were born, 2,000 years, that there were many changes in the way that things were structured over the course of history. So that was my underlying approach in trying to write about the history of the international order. And of course, I was assisted also by the fact that I could draw maps to visualize what I was trying to describe.
But when you, before we get to the map, when you approach these questions about order and when to start, for example, right? How did you think about, or how did you just approach that chapter in general? Like, this is when I should start, this is how I want to categorize the chronology. Like, what was your process?
Well, in fact, I didn't have a choice. The volume 3 of the Cambridge history starts in 1800.
Oh, okay.
It's not a rigid starting point. We're allowed to go a little bit earlier or start a little bit later. But 1800 was a relatively significant watershed in Southeast Asian history. It was the period before Southeast Asia. 1800 is a relatively important watershed in Southeast Asian history. The period before 1800 is often characterized as the early modern period. After 1800, we start to get modern colonialism and the imposition of modern economic and political structures in the region. So it's very useful to start in 1800 because I could embed the chapter in a much older history as the starting point,
Yeah.
but could move fairly quickly to the way in which things changed under the impact of the modern world.
Yeah, and when you conceptualize that map, because that map really shows that kind of pattern of subordinations.
Yes.
And it's not just one subordination, it's many subordinations simultaneously,
Yes.
right? How did you approach that map? Like, what was your, like, oh, I need to make this kind of map. Like, this is the kind of map I need to make, right? Because there could be many different versions, for example, but why did you choose that approach particularly?
It was the product of quite a long-term thought. Originally, I was toying with ways of using a map of Southeast Asia, a physical map of Southeast Asia, to show those relationships.
Yeah.
But of course, the physical map of Southeast Asia is dominated by coastlines and mountains, and those outlines can be a little bit distracting.
Yeah.
So at a certain point, I started drawing circles on the map of Southeast Asia, and it occurred to me, perhaps I don't need the physical map at all. I can just have a thematic map, a stylized map of the region. And once I began to toy with that idea, I needed to think of the design and whether the structure would work, but it ended up coming together.
Interesting, and it also really carried that idea of Southeast Asia as a fluid region with so many different patterns of interactions, so many different loyalty, right? Did that project and that map specifically change or reinforce perhaps your thinking about power in Southeast Asia?
It's a good... there's always an interaction between mapping and writing when I'm working on a project. So I'm thinking as I write how I might be able to present my findings in map form, but in turn looking at the maps, looking at what comes out when I turn something into a map, has an impact on the way in which I write the textual section. So constructing this thematic map of the relations among great and small powers in Southeast Asia was quite important in helping me to streamline the argument in the chapter.
And my last questions would tie in this various theme of intellectual curiosity and just basically, this skill as a scholar to self-taught, right? What would be your advice for students of Southeast Asia when they want to approach this region and when they want to equip themselves with necessary skill to fulfill their interests? Basically, what would be, your advice on that?
Well, Southeast Asia as a field of study is remarkably understudied. So the amount of scholarship that has been completed on Southeast Asia is tiny in comparison with most other parts of the world, tiny in comparison with China, Japan, India, tiny in comparison with Europe and the United States. So we have the luxury that there are many, many things that we could do. So my general advice would be choose an area that you find fascinating and follow that. But don't imagine that you will always only be the expert in that area. It's immensely enriching to look at other regions, to look at other topics, and to find how those topics engage or interact with each other.
And definitely stay curious and continue to learn.
Exactly.
And better yourself. Thank you so much, Robert, for this. And this is Southeast Asianist.